Hello students, this is the review of assignment number 3, and I needed to get this out to you before the midterm because there's a question on the midterm that is very relevant to what I can teach you based on your work toward assignment number 3. And so let's get started on this. The first thing you have to start with assignment number 3 is this idea that you've got to define a population of interest, and you've also got to define your study population. They're related to each other, but the parameters of each are very different, and it's very difficult to sometimes get your mind wrapped around that when you're designing a study or when you're trying to create this mindset, when you're trying to get your mind wrapped around exactly what it is that you're studying. So on page 135 in the textbook, it talks about how it is rare that correlational or experimental designs are conducted without first describing the variables of interest. In particular, descriptive and correlational research often go hand in hand because these are both non-experimental designs. Remember chapters 4 and 5, this is from chapter 4. Remember chapters 4 and 5 are primarily the focus of question number 4 on the midterm. And chapter 7 is about correlational design. So at this point here, I'm focusing primarily on, and assignment number 3 was intended to help you focus on this idea of descriptive research design. So we're trying to describe our population here, and this was as it relates to sexually transmitted diseases within a very highly focused population of interest, namely adolescents and young adults who went through normal, traditional science-based sex education and those who went through Title V restricted abstinence-only sex education. So that's how we're trying to describe our population of interest. The population of interest is basically every young adult and adolescent in the United States. But we're going to narrow that down. So we're first off, we're going to have to study everybody. So that population of interest can't be eliminated except for through asking a question on a survey. So you open the question to these young adults: did you take science-based sex education? Did you take Title V restricted abstinence-only sex education? Or did you not even experience sex education? So that third identifier, remember we're talking about nominal data now, which is part of assignment question number 4 on the midterm. That nominal data identifier is: I had regular sex education, I had Title V restricted sex education, or I didn't have any sex education at all. So that group there is going to go off of our radar because we are only interested in an independent variable that compares Title V restricted sex education to traditional science-based sex education. And we're not studying that third set, that third identifier is out of there. Okay, so at this point here, for part 3 of assignment number 3, I asked you to define your study population based on how you had proposed to operationalize your research in part 2. So I couldn't really tell you, if you look at page 135, and there's a practice 4.3, I believe it is, and then in the back it says answers will vary. Well, yeah, the answers will vary based on how you answered part number 2 to assignment number 3. So I can't really tell you in this video how you should have defined your study population. But the population of interest is very clearly identified by what I've just described now. So many of you had trouble identifying the population of interest, which made it impossible to carve out the study population when operationalizing the research. So if you didn't get the population of interest in your head before you tried to answer part 2 of assignment number 3, you were going to be unsuccessful. It was impossible to be successful on part 3 of assignment number 3 if you didn't really get that in part 2. So that's why this was very important, and that's why I started this review talking about that. So now the model that it asked you to diagram in part 1. The model here needed to be, as a dependent variable, this idea that we needed to know a rate of sexually transmitted diseases, especially HIV. Okay, that's what we're after, is a rate. So the unit of analysis is going to be very, very specific as it relates to getting that rate. So sexually transmitted diseases, this is from the Center for Disease Control webpage. Sexually transmitted diseases are reported as rates per 100,000. Okay, so the Center for Disease Control, looking at the entire U.S. population, looks at rate per 100,000. So we're not going to be able to go on that kind of a rate, but we still need to have, and this is why you're population of interest is very important because within that population of interest, there will be the population of interest. So that's the rate, that gives you the baseline, 100,000, 10,000, 1,000, and then you establish your rate. So what you have to look at for your unit of analysis is what is one unit within your population of interest. One unit, therefore, is an adolescent or young adult in the United States. That's the population of interest. And then we're going to sort it out by the identifier, but the unit of interest is the young adult or adolescent in the United States. Now back to the model here. The independent variable we're interested in is the Title V abstinence-only sex education. This has been already established based on the 3 questions. Did you have Title V, abstinence-only sex education? Did you experience science-based education? Or did you not have any science, not any sex education at all? So we've got 3 identifiers. We're only interested in 2 of them. Your independent variable is just yes or no question. So now, we've got all of that set out. We've got your population of interest, your study population, your sample population is now what you need to look at. Your sample population is made up of those that we are able to contact in some way and must include a control group and our experimental group. So we have to get a sample population that has individuals who answered yes or no to Title V funded abstinence-only education. We are not interested in young adults that did not have any form of sex education. That's what I'm talking about there as well. And we are definitely still going to be interested in them whether or not they've chosen to be sexually active. So we do not want to, and when you're identifying your population, don't go into the idea that we're only looking at sexually active adolescents or young adults, because the target of abstinence-only education was to ensure that they not enter into sexual activity, and that is definitely a way that's going to protect them from getting a sexually transmitted disease. So we need them in our study. Whether or not they were sexually active or not is not going to determine whether they're in our study population. So the unit of analysis here for your independent variable I've already talked about. It is what separates our control group from our experimental group. And now we are into what will definitely help you, and this is why I needed to get this video out to you before you take the midterm, is because this will help you also answer question number 4 and question number 3, I believe, on the midterm exam. So the midterm exam has questions that relate very, very intricately to assignment number 3. So now that we look at a cross-tabulation, and the reason I put this cross-tabulation up there is because we are describing our study population through this kind of an analysis and a cross-tabulation table, just thinking of it in your mind, and you'll get to the point where you can actually imagine this in your mind without actually having to draw it out. So in this case here, we are looking at a study where we could determine, for example, and I kept it at 5 identifiers because I used this table of 5 in the midterm. I wanted to keep it 5, but you could spread it out a little further and have a separate category for every kind of sexually transmitted disease, which would be very useful. But here I left it at 5. First category, never had an STD, never had a sexually transmitted disease. Contracted HIV or AIDS, contracted chlamydia, contracted gonorrhea, contracted syphilis or another STD. So we've got 5 identifiers. These are the identifier nominal categories in this study here. And once again, we now need to establish magnitude, the orders of magnitude. And I left the parameters here on the orders of magnitude based on what you are going to see on your midterm exam. But in the case of these studying our intervening variable, which is why I put this up here, our intervening variables now are going to, we need to determine through these intervening variables the prevalence of misinformation in population, the prevalence of misinformation in our population of teens. And that's the orders of magnitude that we're looking at now. So for the relationship that the independent variable has with the dependent variable can be impacted by these 2 intervening variables, and these intervening variables can only be described, and this is what we're looking at, is a descriptive study into how prevalent misinformation is among these 2 teen populations, the ones that had abstinence-only education and the ones who had science-based sex education may have a very, very distinct degree of misinformation within their population. So that's what this information, that's what this study here is going to look at in orders of magnitude, is what are the orders of magnitude as it relates to misinformation. Do they know how to put on a condom? Do they know that a condom prevents HIV/AIDS? Do they know that other practices, which may be just old wives' tales and completely wrong misinformation about sexually transmitted diseases? And you need to determine that in degrees of magnitude. And you didn't have to do that for assignment number 3, but it is an intervening variable, just like I have you define on the midterm exam. So degrees of magnitude in misinformation, and the other table here is the degrees of magnitude in sexual promiscuity. So somebody who is very, very sexually promiscuous and is out there having sex all the time is obviously going to have a much higher exposure rate and probability of contracting sexually transmitted diseases. So that is an intervening factor, is going to impact the relationship between our independent and dependent variables. And so that's why we needed to also identify that. So those are the 2 intervening variables that I would put into there. Now for assignment number 3, you actually had to write your hypothesis. And we started with a null hypothesis. So remember the 2-tailed normal curve here. The region of acceptance for your null hypothesis, you need to write a null hypothesis for this region of acceptance here, the center region of acceptance. We have a bottom tail on the low end and a top tail on the high end. So a higher rate of sexually transmitted diseases would be found in this 2.5% region of rejection, and a lower rate of STDs would put us into this 2.5% region of rejection here. So you need to first write your null hypothesis that'll get into here, unless you're going to write a null hypothesis that is one-tailed. So if you're going to do a one-tailed hypothesis for your null, you would write it to accept everything down here so that it could include everything down here, and your area of rejection would be this top 5% now, because we always go for a 95% confidence level. Okay, so how to write the null hypothesis? My personal choice for a null hypothesis is this: there is no statistically significant difference in the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases between youth and young adults who experience science-based sex education and those that experience Title V restricted abstinence-only sex education. Okay, so this has been written in a way that it will actually work for a 2-tailed hypothesis. It didn't define anything that was outside of a typical probability. Okay, so these probabilities that we have to work with, like flipping a coin, that's what your null hypothesis has to actually embrace, is this probability that there's not going to be any difference between Title V restricted sex education and science-based sex education. So it's an absence of the alternative hypothesis. So now that we think about our alternative hypothesis, we can write it in one of 2 ways. If I wanted to write an alternative hypothesis as a 2-tailed option, I would write youth and young adults who experienced Title V restricted abstinence-only sex education and who therefore likely never had any science-based instruction in how condoms and other safe practices might prevent STDs will manifest a statistically significant difference in the rate of STDs when compared to a population that were taught from a science-based sex education curriculum that clearly outlined safe sex practices. So now that we've written our alternative hypothesis, we go back to look at our null hypothesis and make sure that we didn't state the opposite. Because if we stated the opposite of our alternative hypothesis, that's another alternative hypothesis. Okay, you have to be very, very careful that you don't write 2 alternative hypotheses that are just opposite from each other, because all you've got then is 2 alternative hypotheses. You don't have a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis is the absence of what you claimed in your alternative hypothesis. So here in our alternative hypothesis, we're hoping to be able to claim, after we do our research, that abstinence-only sex education made a difference in sexually transmitted diseases. So, and we want that to be, in my way of thinking, in this way of thinking here, it says just makes a difference in the rate of STDs. So we're leaving this open as 2-tailed. Maybe abstinence-only education actually decreases the incident rate of sexually transmitted diseases. That's what they would definitely like to have found. Those who are advocates of abstinence-only Title V funding would like to know, oh, okay, we reduced pregnancies and we also reduced the rate of actual sexually transmitted diseases. That would have been perfect. So this two-tailed hypothesis states it in such a way that if there is a lower rate of sexually transmitted diseases, we can also reject the null hypothesis because it's lower than we expected. But in my idea here, I'm thinking that it's probably going to be higher than. But either way, I'm making a claim that there is a statistically significant difference here. So what I want in my null hypothesis is the absence of that claim. So it has to say, it can't be the opposite. It has to be, there is no statistically significant difference in the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases, regardless of what kind of sex education you had. Now, my personal choice for an alternative hypothesis has the advantage of putting everything in the top 5%. In this region of rejection. So I've doubled the size of the area of rejection here by saying I only want a one-tailed hypothesis. So how do I write a one-tailed hypothesis? All I do is I change the word significant difference in the rate of STDs to say significantly higher rate of STDs. So my hypothesis says, you know what, I'm only looking for stuff at the top end here because the nature of my investigation here, the nature of my research is primarily oriented towards looking for a higher rate of STDs. And so I doubled the size by just looking at the top tail. I get to double the area from 2.5% to 5% in the region of rejection. Okay, that's the importance of having the one-tailed, two-tailed hypotheses, is that it makes it easier for me to reject the null because I made the area that I'm targeting, the way I'm looking at it for my alternative hypothesis, twice as big. That's it for assignment number 3. Good luck on the midterm. And if you haven't done assignment number 3, remember you can still do assignment number 3 based on this video. You can write a perfect, absolutely perfect assignment number 3 up. And I just have to cut your points in half because you missed the deadline and you had the advantage of watching the video. But you will still get 10 out of 20 points. So don't not do assignment number 3 if you actually did it late, because that's going to impact your grade significantly more than if you do this. You got to remember, out of 500 points, losing 10 points means that you just lost 2 percentage points off the top. So now instead of getting a 95% on the final grade, you can get a 93% if you still hand this in. But if you don't hand this in, you're going to lose 4 percentage points and you'll be down to a 91%. If you're down at the 70% level, it could actually mean the difference between getting credit for the course and not getting any credit for the course. So please finish assignment number 3 even if you're filing it late, because it makes a big difference if you're right on that cusp. Thanks, and good luck on the midterm.